There has been a giant looming problem that has been everywhere and everyone's been talking about, and that's the debt crisis. The failure of the debt ceiling to be raised and the effects of the on the economy that could come with has been nonstop talked about. But what if I told you that every single time this is exactly what happens? Every single time there is a debt ceiling problem, which is every few years at this point, that they make it very political. Either side does it every single time, and they go to the very end, and then all of a sudden the solution comes out and the debt ceiling gets raised. Will this be what happens here? Probably. I think that that's going to be the biggest solution, right? Because that's just what happens every single time. It's literally like it's on repeat. If you pay attention to what's happening now and see all of the fuss that's being made, everything that's being talked about, realize it now, and in 2 or 3 years, when we hit the new debt ceiling, it will play out the exact same way. But there is that small chance, right, that it doesn't, that this time is different, and that this time the US actually defaults, which would be pretty catastrophic for the economy, for rates, for everything, really. And we can see that the market is putting a pretty big premium on that, saying the US now has a higher credit risk than Mexico, Greece, and Brazil. So those are obviously not countries that you're really going to be wanting to get compared to if you're the US. Greece has already defaulted in the past. I think within the last like 10 or 15 years, maybe 20 years or something, Greece literally had a huge crisis that they had going on. So to be, compared to them, that's not the greatest thing. And we have Janet Yellen making the rounds constantly here saying, that she reaffirmed that the US could run out of money to pay bills by early June. So that's the timetable, right? Saying there was some sort of accounting tricks that they could do to extend this stuff, and that June is going to be the end. When June comes, if there's no increase in the debt ceiling, then there's the default happening right there. So she actually has a quote here saying, waiting until the last minute to suspend or increase the debt limit can cause serious harm to business and consumer confidence, raise short-term borrowing costs for taxpayers, and negatively impact the credit rating of the US. Now, all of that is obviously true. If you wait till the last minute, then people are going to be prepared for a scenario where it doesn't actually work out. So yeah, it would be stressful on businesses, harmful for them to plan on what are they going to do in the future if so many things happen with rates and their ability to get money and loans and how they operate. It can cause a pretty nasty spiraled effect, and nobody really wants that, but every single year or every single few years when this problem comes up, it's always the talking point. And then to get more specific in the time frame in which the debt limit needs to be increased, says that the debt limit remains unchanged. There is a significant risk that at some point in the first 2 weeks of June, the government will no longer be able to pay all of its obligations. So that's the timetable, right? The first half of June, if there's no increase, if there's nothing happening by then default is apparently going to happen there. Now, I still don't think that default is going to happen, because this is literally every single time. It's the exact same playbook. It was just a few years ago that the same thing happened. And then guess what? Near the end, they magically raised the debt limit and were able to solve all the problems. So I guess that that's going to be the same thing that happens this time, because I just don't see a reason for people to not want to push the debt ceiling and make things worse, because kicking the can down the road is the best plan that the government has. I mean, just look at these numbers. You can't really beat them. $31 trillion in national debt with a deficit of almost $1.5 trillion. So the government clearly knows what they're doing with money. And I know the biggest reason that people, or that I think one side, I think it's Republicans saying they don't want to raise the debt ceiling, is because the government is irresponsible with money, which clearly they are. All you got to do is look at these numbers. Taking in $4.5 trillion in tax revenue, but spending $6 trillion is not it's not sustainable. That's not responsible. That's like somebody pulling in $100,000 a year, but spending $150,000 a year. The more you continue to do that, you can't sustain that. But the government can open up as many new lines of credit and credit cards that they want. But if a normal person were to do that, at some point you would actually collapse under that debt. which could be the scenario that plays out in the US, right? At some point, this debt, if you don't actually address it and deal with it and make a plan to deal with it, then you have the bigger problems down the road. When you keep kicking the can down the road, eventually you run out of road. I mean, just the payments on debt alone is like almost $1 trillion right now. And a bunch of that debt is going to go up to higher rates that are going up right now. So it's going to get refinanced to be even higher payments. So at some point, your interest payments on the debt becomes the most money you're spending every year, and that doesn't help anybody. That is money you're burning. But the biggest talk too here was with all of these talks going on, and everyone's been talking about this, saying like, has the US ever failed to make these debt payments? And that says no. And a big thing is everyone's saying that the US has never defaulted and it would never default, but that's not true. I think Biden's tweets got fact checked or something, or community noted on Twitter, and they put out a few years of defaults and explained things. But there's at least one that you can point to and show that yes, the U.S. has defaulted in the past, and it was this right here when Nixon ended the convertibility of dollars to gold. That was a time that the U.S. defaulted because it failed to live up to what it promised it was going to do and its obligations, because it just said, yes, everybody can take dollars, turn them into gold. If you give us dollars, we'll give you the gold equivalent of that dollar. But at some point, everything got out of control. The money printer printed too much money, and there wasn't enough gold. But instead of getting caught in their lie and collapsing, they just said, no, you can't do this anymore. And that is technically the default. I don't know about the other years that were in the fact check thing, but you can at least point to this and say the U.S. has done this before. It's not something that has never been done. It is unprecedented. It has happened. But I guess that is slightly different because the debt payments are what people are paying or are saying here. And I guess the U.S. hasn't ever missed a debt payment. I don't know that for 100%. I don't know other years and everything. I'm not some historian on this stuff, but it's all just political theater at the end of the day, because this happens every single time that the debt limit becomes a problem. And maybe the debt limit wouldn't become a problem if the government would be a little bit more responsible with spending money, and instead of spending, trillions of dollars over what they get, just spend $4.5 trillion correctly and actually allocate it correctly, because that's a ton of money. But for some reason, no one seems to think about that. Everyone freaked out when Elon Musk bought Twitter for $44 billion, saying he could end world hunger or something. But this government's taking in $4.5 trillion a year. And no one bats an eye that just disappears. But I guess we'll have our answer by next month. Either the U.S. defaults or the debt limit gets raised. I probably would be willing to bet that the debt limit gets raised. But that's going to do it for this video. As always, don't forget to smash the like button and subscribe. And I'll see you guys in my next video.